This is the second video about urban trends in Geography Terminal. The video is about the causes of urban growth. There are basically two kinds of causes to urban growth, and most of this chapter will be dedicated to the first one, which is in fact rural-urban migration, when people move away from countryside to join cities. When this process is massive and fast, it is called rural flight. Rural flight is happening at the moment in many countries of Africa, for instance, but it already happened long ago in Western Europe. In Britain, it started in the late 18th century and developed throughout the 19th century, changing the country and more generally the continent forever. These forms of migrations are explained by the now very famous push-pull model, which was coined by a man named Lee, of which I don't know anything more. And I don't even know his first name, by the way. It is based on the simple distinction between push and pull factors. So a push factor would be any feature in an environment that can be considered repulsive and so may induce people to move away from the place they live in. On the contrary, a pull factor will be an attractive characteristic that will lead people to choose a certain destination for their migration. So applied to rural-urban migrations, the push-pull model is pretty simple. It will explain why people move from rural areas to big cities. Actually, the most common pattern of migration, the one that concerns the largest number of people, is what we call stepped migration, which means that people will first migrate to a small town and before in a second town maybe move to a big city. This is what happens for the vast majority of the people. One thing that should not be forgotten is that everybody does not migrate. Why not? Well, because of the presence of barriers to migration. They are extremely important. I'm sure you can understand what are the barriers to international migrations. Well, the existence of borders basically is a barrier. But when it comes to internal migrations, migrations from countryside to cities within a country, they also exist. Take language, for example. It may be surprising because we are now in a country where people speak the same language in their great majority. But the fact that we all speak the same language in France is, historically speaking, a recent situation. It was not true 2 centuries ago, and it was not completely true 50 years ago. My great-grandmother did not really speak French, and yet she was born in France, but she spoke some local language. This is how many people that live in countryside communities do. And this is still a very massive phenomenon all over the world. In Africa, in Asia, the people that live in rural areas, they often don't speak the same language as the people that live in cities. They speak a local dialect. But that is a barrier. The cost of travel is another one. Distance is a barrier. The dangers of the journey is also a barrier. In particular, in LICs, security is not as satisfactory as in HICs, and so when you travel, and in particular when you travel with nothing, you're risking your life. So, in fact, barriers to migration are precisely overcome by only a minority of people. That is very important. Only a minority of people emigrate. That is true at all scales. And push-pull factors are the reasons why some people overcome the barriers to migration. From this moment, it's very simple. People leave rural areas because they will find that job opportunities are very few. It's particularly true when farming, which is by far the dominant activity in the countryside, when farming is being mechanized, becomes more productive, and so less workers are needed. Access to facilities and services may not be satisfactory, and in some specific cases, less and less specific unfortunately, problems linked to environment may also become push factors. We must talk about desertification, I think, these days, because many areas in the Sahel, for example, and also in India, are faced with a fast process of greater aridity linked to climate change. So as a result, the land becomes unsuitable to farming, and of course this is already creating and will create very important flows of people. A natural event like a drought or a cyclone can also be a push factor, and situation of civil war or terrorist violence may also affect rural areas. So all these reasons will lead some people to move away. And it must not be forgotten that all push factors are made worse by the big population growth that exists in most LICs. Fast population growth may lead to overpopulation, which means that in a given area the population becomes too big compared to what society and economy can provide. Okay? In cities, people will find more job opportunities and more diverse jobs. That's very important. They will also find better access to facilities and services like education, higher education, hospitals. I mean, everything is very simple here. One thing that you may not realize is that people want to have access to money. Money is much more abundant and commonly used in cities, and in many rural areas money is almost absent. One very important thing: the perceived image is more important than reality when it comes to migration. People who live in rural areas, they don't exactly know what urban life will be like. What really matters is the image they have of it. Try to measure what urban life means to a young man or woman who's born to a family of farmers somewhere in Africa or India. It means modernity. It means some kind of social and economic dream. Even in France, in small towns like Limoges, young people dream of spending the future life, their studies in bigger cities like Bordeaux, Toulouse or Paris. Okay, so imagine what it means for a farmer in Africa whose family has been farming the land for centuries. It is extremely important, even though real urban life might be difficult. And lastly, emigration is also a dynamic process. I mean, if people when people have migrated to cities, they then make connections with their relatives in the countryside by sending information and money as well, and remittances. So connections between rural areas and big cities will make emigration a bigger process. And so that is a reason why it is often an important wave. So now, let's take the example of Mumbai. The urban growth of Mumbai has been very impressive. If you compare the table and the graph here, you will see that the figures, they don't match. But remember what I said, figures don't matter, really. The trend is more important. In the 1950s, Mumbai was an urban area populated by 3 to 5 million people. Depends on what exactly you call Mumbai. What is sure is that today it is an urban area of more than 20 million inhabitants. many of these originated from the countryside. And it's clear that the pattern of push and pull factors in India is very striking. In the countryside, a bit more than half of the people have electricity at home. Only 20%, even less, have toilets at home. Okay, these levels are much higher in cities, and people know that. Just one remark about Kacha house, which is an expression you can read on the right side of the graph. A Kacha house is a shanty of which the walls are made of mud. So it's a very, very traditional form of housing. It still represents one house out of 5 in the Indian countryside. And on the other hand, Mumbai is the New York City of India. It is the city many young Indian people dreams about, because it's the most dynamic city of the country, and that's not new. The city was created by some Europeans. They created a port here. It's a very good natural site for a port. The Portuguese and then the British developed it as part of the British Empire during colonial times. And even after independence, Mumbai remained a gateway to India for European trade. This is the reason why today Mumbai is still the busiest port in the country. Many export-led industries like garment or chemicals are located in the Mumbai area. And moreover, and that's also a legacy of British times, it is the financial capital of the city. This is where you find the stock exchange and many banks. And today you can also find many headquarters of big Indian TNCs like Tata, for example. So here you can see a picture of the Mumbai Stock Exchange, and the other picture is a reference to the movie industry of Mumbai, Bollywood, which of course is extremely famous all over the world, but particularly attractive, you may understand that, to the people of India. In the end, Mumbai represents only 1.5 or 2% of the population of the country, but 5% of the country's GDP, and even more than this, 25% of the industrial production and 30% of foreign trade. So it is really an economic core, and for this reason it is extremely attractive. By the way, we would find the same pattern in Nigeria with Lagos, and even more important in Lagos, because actually Lagos represents 50% of the GDP of Nigeria. Okay, so in India, the rural flight is still happening now. It is illustrated on this map, where you can see that in many counties of India, more than 25% of houses have a migrant who has gone in a city. And in this map, you can see that in suburban Mumbai, and it's true of many other cities, 30% of the population are migrants who come from the countryside. So that's really a current pattern for a country like India. And even though rural flight is extremely important, in numbers, the urban growth is mostly due to natural increase. That is to say, the difference between number of births and number of deaths. In cities of the global south, fertility rates remain rather high, even though they are lower than in the countryside often. And let's not forget that most of the new city dwellers are young adults. So many people living in cities have children in cities. Okay, The result of this is that a city like Lagos, for example, has half of its population who is under 25 years old.